Most have thought of or considered telepathy at some point in their life, but often these notions are pushed aside as being social or intellectual taboo. For me, these notions grew to be more than what I could intellectually consider to be coincidence alone. As my interest in telepathy grew, so did my personal collection of experiments. I've personally conducted experiments, makeshift experiments in which the results were much higher than the intended outcome by coincidence alone. A great example of this would be a number experiment done between me and my female friend, in which the success rating of guessing a number between 1 and 10 would be constantly averaged out to be roughly 60% success rating, rather than the predicted 10% success rating marked by coincidence alone. Perhaps the most compelling was the occurrence in which the number was successfully conveyed 10 consecutive times. Although this research by no stretch of the imagination is scientific proof, is nonetheless utterly compelling. I myself do not consider telepathy to be mystic, magic, or unnatural. I have compiled and edited a lecture done by Rupert Sheldrake, in which he has described the phenomenon indicated of the existence of telepathy in both animals and human beings. I have highlighted the key points in his lecture. As Dr. Rupert Sheldrake explains, telepathy is considered to be a social taboo and is often mocked in the scientific community. Telepathy and research like it is a virtually uncharted territory and is much needed and deserved scientific research. This brief video is very important towards the positive advancement of science and humanity. Please share.
The theme of telepathy is particularly appropriate because the Perrott-Warwick Fund was set up in memory of Frederick Myers, a Fellow of Trinity College, and one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research in 1882. And it was Myers who coined the word telepathy. He was a Greek scholar. And of course, telepathy means tele, as in distant, as in television, telephone, and feeling, as in empathy, sympathy. So telepathy literally means distant feeling. In the early days of the Society for Psychical Research, one of the big issues was the survival of bodily death. And that was one of the topics Myers himself was very interested in. I think partly because telepathy was associated with this quest for evidence for survival, the focus was on telepathy in human beings. Now this made it more controversial than it needed been, because the people who opposed telepathy were people who saw themselves as heirs of Enlightenment rationalism, who saw an opposition between what they thought of as the advance of science and reason, as opposed to religion and superstition, which they thought were holding humanity back. Telepathy got classified as superstition because so many people believe in it. This meant that telepathy has always been controversial, and it's always been something that people who believe in a kind of materialist worldview feel that they need to oppose. Now, I'm going to talk this evening about the evolution of telepathy. My point is that it's not actually supernormal or supernatural, but that it's, or paranormal, it's natural, normal, and a part of animal nature. It occurs in many different species of animals, and human telepathy is simply one aspect of a much more widespread phenomenon. I might say just one or two words about why I got interested in this subject. I was educated in a normal scientific way at school and at Cambridge, and I absorbed the standard scientific mindset, which involved, at least when I was being educated, atheism, materialism, and total skepticism to all psychic phenomena. This was just part of the standard issue mindset that people of my generation grew up with, and still many young scientists today follow that same way of thinking. So I thought telepathy was absolute rubbish, that it couldn't possibly happen because the mind's nothing but the activity of the brain, it's all inside the head. and so telepathy must be rubbish, therefore all evidence for it must either be fraudulent or flawed. And there are many people who still think that today, of course. But what stopped me thinking like that was an experience in Cambridge in the biochemistry department. One time in the tea room, someone brought up the topic of telepathy, and along with several other research students, I said, oh, it's absolute rubbish, and said all the standard skeptical things. But sitting nearby was one of the older members of the department, Sir Rudolph Peters, previously Professor of Biochemistry at Oxford, who in his retirement was working in our lab here in Cambridge. And Sir Rudolph said to me, have you ever looked at the evidence for it? And I said, no, I don't need to. He said, well, I have, and he said, I think there might be something in it. And he then told me about an investigation he'd done. A friend of his called E.G. Recordon was an ophthalmologist in Cambridge. He was treating a boy who was severely disabled, who was almost blind and who was mentally retarded. And when he was doing standard eye tests, he was astonished that this boy could actually read all the letters on the eye charts, and he knew he couldn't possibly read them, and at first he thought it was lucky guesswork. Then he thought maybe it was happening through the mother, and he asked the mother to leave the room, and the boy couldn't do it. He told Sir Rudolph Peters, and they set up some simple tests with the boy and the mother separated by a screen, and they showed her letters and numbers, and the boy immediately said what they were. They then set up an experiment over the telephone with the boy at home in Cambridge and the mother in Babraham in a laboratory 6 miles away. They showed the mother cards, a random number of sequence of letters and numbers, which were pre-randomized. She looked at them, and the boy would then say what she was looking at. With the letters, he should have been right one time in 26, on average 3.8%. He was actually right 38% of the time in more than 100 trials. These were massively significant results. And Sir Rudolph Peters was convinced that something was really going on. The only possible clues could have been by subtle sound clues. They had magicians listen to the tape to see if there was any fraud. I listened to them myself. And Peters convinced me that this research showed something was really going on. He was an honest man. He was totally had no axe to grind. And I was very impressed by the fact that here was a piece of research that showed something was really happening. When I discussed it with my colleagues, they reacted exactly as I'd reacted myself, saying, oh, it must be flawed. They weren't interested in looking at the evidence. And I realized this is a diagnostic feature of skepticism about psychic phenomena, an unwillingness to look at the evidence because of a firm belief it must be untrue. Well, I didn't drop everything and start working on telepathy because I was working on other things. I was working on plant morphogenesis. And in the course of my work on plant development here in Cambridge and then later in India in an agricultural institute, I got interested in the concept of morphogenetic fields. This is a widespread concept within developmental biology. The idea was promoted principally here in Britain by C.H. Waddington, who was Professor of Genetics in Edinburgh. And it was the idea that living organisms are shaped by invisible fields that mold the way they develop, and that these fields are needed to explain how development occurs in animals and plants. Now, I won't go into the details of morphogenesis and its unsolved problems, but I got interested in these fields and I came to the conclusion there must be some new kind of field at work in living organisms that wasn't just the standard fields of physics and wasn't just chemical diffusions. I worked on the chemistry of the main plant hormone auxin, and I knew more than anyone, I think, at the time about plant hormones that affected plant development. And yet it simply didn't answer, the chemical answer wasn't going to work, and it still hasn't worked. As I got interested in morphogenetic fields, I read Waddington's books and those of others. And what they were part of was a holistic view of nature that can be represented here. Nature is organized in a series of nested hierarchies. The little circles could be subatomic particles in atoms, in molecules, in crystals, or they could be organelles in cells, in tissues, in organs. That everything in nature is organized in this nested hierarchy. At each level, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Now, when it comes to social organization, the fields are the organization of termite societies, of flocks of birds, of packs of wolves. If the three inner circles represent individual animals, the outer one could represent the whole social group. So from this theory, I arrived at the idea social groups must have organizing fields. These must coordinate the individual members even when they're at a distance. And then I realized that if that were the case, it could give rise to forms of communication at a distance which would show up as telepathy. It seemed to follow from this theory. So I started looking at social animals, and my aim was to see whether if telepathy existed, it was part of social organization in animals, and that it must have evolved along with social groups. One kind of animal society are termites, and this huge termite mound is constructed by millions of insects building elaborate architectural structures coordinated in a way that no one yet understands. Part of it's by smell, part of it's by tapping sounds. It's not by sight because they're blind. And yet they can make these huge structures in a way that's still not understood. In the 1920s, a South African biologist, Eugene Marais, found that if you damage termite mounds, they can repair them. And he put a steel plate into a damaged mound in such a way that there was no communication across it. And yet, on both sides, the termites built tunnels and arches that corresponded with those on the other side, as if there was an invisible blueprint. He thought that there must be a group soul in the termite colony. I would think of it as a field, a kind of morphogenetic field of animal architecture. Now, in flocks of birds, and here you see a flock of starlings over Brighton West Pier, and here are some more pictures of starlings. The entire flock moves in a coordinated way. The animals change direction without bumping into each other. They must anticipate where their neighbors are moving extremely fast. In the 80s, people modeled bird flocks using a simple form of computer modeling based on nearest neighbor analysis. But that simply won't work. They do it too fast. And the best modern computer models of flocks treat them as fields, as if each bird is, as it were, a magnetic domain within a magnetic field, combined with the hydrodynamics of flow. And these models, which are field models, give the best representations of flock behavior. These two, I think, are field phenomena. The kind of field they are is what I call a morphic field, a field that's concerned with form or shape. The same applies to schools of fish. They can change direction almost instantly when a predator approaches and move apart in what's called a flash expansion without bumping into each other. So they not only know where the others are, but they know where the others are going to go. So how is this coordinated? Nobody yet knows. And these were things that made me think that perhaps there are indeed features at work in social groups which lead to forms of communication we don't yet understand, but which are part of biology. They're not supernatural, they're not paranormal, they're normal, they're part of the ordinary coordination of animal groups. Now, the same should apply to animal groups like packs of wolves. When they're together, of course, they can see each other and communicate by sound, sight, and all the normal senses. But when adult wolves go hunting, they often range over hundreds of miles. They leave the young, the cubs, in the den with a babysitter. And the idea here would be that the field that joins them stretches like a kind of invisible elastic band that continues to connect them at a distance, and could be a channel for telepathic communication. This was a kind of rather vague metaphoric theory. But what it did was made me look into the literature on wolves and wild animals. And of course, in recent years, there's been very little research. This is such a taboo topic that nobody within biology will touch it if they want to get a grant or a job. And of course, most people want grants and jobs. So it's so taboo, it's so forbidden that despite a fascinating beginning to this field of research by William Long, summarized in his book, How Animals Talk, first published in 1919. What he shows is that he tracked wolves for months in Canada, months on end over many years. And he was convinced they were communicating at a distance without the neat use of sound. Of course, he knew they howled and so forth, but without howling, they could still tell not only what the others were doing, but where they were. And through tracking them, he could show how they were able to join up over many miles, suggesting an invisible form of communication. He found a similar thing in groups of birds when they were feeding apart from the rest of the flock. And he became convinced that animals in groups in the wild are communicating telepathically with each other. And this is how they stay in touch. The only way the group can stay in touch at a distance would be by telepathy, when they're beyond the range of the senses. This would have survival value and would be part of their normal way of life. Incidentally, the wolf example reminds us of a physical analogy. In physics, if two particles have been part of the same system and they move apart, they can remain non-locally connected or entangled so that a change in one instantly affects the other. When Einstein realized this implication of quantum theory, he thought quantum theory must be wrong because it would allow for what he called a spooky action at a distance. Experiments show that quantum theory is right, Einstein was wrong, and quantum entanglement is now being applied in quantum computing and in quantum cryptography. There's a mysterious connection at a distance, and it's not distance dependent. It's just as strong over a mile as over a centimeter. And it's particularly interesting because in telepathy that appears to be the case too. I'm not saying these phenomena are quantum entanglement. I'm saying that quantum entanglement provides us with an interesting analogy within physics. Well, all this is simply background, really, to the question of does telepathy really happen in animals? And when I decided to start working on this, when I realized that nobody had ever really addressed this question. After Long's book in 1919, there'd been virtually complete silence on this front. A few amateur naturalists had explored the idea, but they knew if they wanted to get papers published in scientific journals, you shouldn't mention it. Now, what do we make of this scientifically? Well, the great majority of people, my scientific friends who I discussed it with, showed no curiosity whatever. They just said, oh, well, it's obviously just routine, or the people at home give subtle cues, or they must be hearing or smelling the people from a long distance away. The case studies showed that that was not an adequate explanation. Anyway, I started doing the experiments that I thought of in this conversation with Nick Humphrey. And what we found was that with dogs that do it fairly reliably, they could do it over and over and over again. Start waiting, not just when the person gets in the car to come home, but when they decide to come home. When we asked them to come home by taxi to avoid familiar car sounds, then the dog reacted when they rang for the taxi, not when they got into it. I set up a whole series of controlled experiments where people went at least 5 miles from home. They came home in taxis at randomly chosen times. I chose the times at random. They didn't know them in advance. I rang them up, or no, I told them with a pager when to go home. And then we filmed the place the dog waited continuously the whole time they were out. These films can be independently evaluated by third parties and give an objective record of the animal's behavior. Of course, they don't make very interesting viewing. Many, many hours of front doormats with the dog going there usually quite a lot just before the person comes home. Anyway, these are some of the quantitative results from the dog JT that I've worked with most. The bottom axis shows 10-minute intervals after the owner went out. The vertical axis shows the number of seconds the dog was at the window or door when she was out. And the final point, the filled-in circle, is the first 10 minutes of her homeward journey. As you see, the dog was at the door most in the first 10 minutes of the homeward journey. But it was already waiting there before she came home, when she decided to come home, but before the car had actually started moving. The dog did go to the window a little bit when she was out, usually when you see it on the film, to bark at passing cats or to look at other dogs or to see people arriving in the street. It's clearly not waiting. But there were these occasional visits. But quantitatively, in these experiments, the time it was at the door for most of her absence, right up until the 10 minutes before she leaves, was about 4% of the time, and it was over 50% of the time when she was on the way home. It was highly significant statistically. when this there was a report about this in the press, and immediately skeptics and skeptic organizations attacked the research, saying that it must be flawed, telepathy was impossible, I'd been duped by the dog owners who'd been communicating by secret phone calls and then activating the dog with high-pitched whistles that I couldn't hear, and I'd simply been taken in. So I'd done the wrong kind of randomization, I'd used the wrong kind of taxi, and so forth. So I had so many of these, it was pointless arguing because people weren't interested in the actual facts. They just wanted to score points, and this happened in the forum of the media. And one of the people who raised these objections was Richard Wiseman, a previous holder of this post. So I invited him to do his own experiments with this dog, which he did. He did 3 tests with his colleague Matthew Smith. These are the results of his 3 tests with the same dog in the same location. As you see, they parallel my own results very closely. But that's not how he saw it. He announced to the waiting world that he'd refuted this dog's abilities because it had been to the window before the owner had set off to come home and therefore given a false alarm, and all the rest of the data could therefore be discarded since it had failed the test. Now, he now admits that these data are virtually identical to my own. But the power of the skeptical, people want to hear a skeptical message in the serious media. And a lot of science journalists amplify that message, and they're not too concerned with the facts. These are the facts. And what they show is that this has actually been independently replicated. Now, there have been other tests of dogs with other dogs and so on, and I think this is now a fairly well-established fact that dogs really do know when their owners are coming home, or at least some of them do, not all. And in some cases they do it at non-routine times. The advantage of this compared with many parapsychology experiments, which are often quite boring, is that dogs never get bored with their owners coming home. They do it over and over again. The most reliable of dogs, I found, JT, did it about 85% of the time. There were occasions he didn't respond. Most of those turned out to be when there was a bitch on heat in the next flat, showing that JT could be distracted. The most extraordinary case of all that I've come across is a telepathic parrot called Enkisi. Now, I was going to show you a video of the parrot doing some extraordinary tests. This is the parrot with the largest vocabulary in the world, currently 1,500 words. The Guinness Book of Records is 800 words. And this parrot picks up his owner's thoughts and intentions and actually says them. People often say of dogs and cats, if only they could speak. Well, here's a parrot that can and does. And we set up tests where we had sealed envelopes containing photographs corresponding to objects the parrot knows the name for. And the owner, Aimee, sat in a room on camera, opened a package, looked at the picture for 2 minutes. The parrot in another room, completely isolated from her, filmed continuously, spoke. And we later had the tapes transcribed independently by 3 different independent transcribers, the words analyzed, and it turned out the parrot did indeed say what she was looking at, way above what you'd expect by chance. If we'd been able to show the video, unfortunately no one knows how to operate it, so we can't. But you would have seen when she looks at a picture of flowers, the parrot says, "That's a flower, that's a pick of flowers, they're little flowers." When she looks at a picture of someone on the phone, it says, "What are you doing on the phone?" And it makes phone dialing noises and said, "That's a phone." In another one where the people are hugging, it says, "That's a hug, that's my hug," and talks about hugs. It's quite extraordinary. It speaks in sentences. That alone is extraordinary. This bird is 2 generations away from the wild. It's an African grey. And in terms of evolutionary bonds, humans have had tens of thousands of years to evolve with dogs, but parrots, most parrots that people keep are either wild caught or only 1 or 2 generations into captivity. And they can not only speak, but use language meaningfully, as Irene Pepperberg showed with her famous parrot Alex, and pick up people's thoughts and utter them in English words. It's a totally astonishing phenomenon. If you're interested, the details are published. I published all these in technical papers in journals, and they're summarized in my books. The main work on animals is summarized in this book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home and Other Unexplained Powers of Animals. Well, these experiments with animals showed that telepathy seems to occur quite widely in the animal kingdom. There are many other ways in which pet owners, dog trainers, blind people with guide dogs, police dog handlers, horse trainers told me that their animals picked up thoughts or intentions, usually to do with things that affect the animal themselves. They know when people are going away, they know when they're coming back, they know when people are planning, dogs often know when people are planning to take them for an otherwise non-routine walk, even if they're in another room. Blind people with guide dogs often find that the dog picks up their intention and takes them where they want to go without them actually having said anything about it. There, of course, there is a physical contact through the harness, so there could be subtle cues. But there's a huge field of research here, virtually unexplored. This is virgin scientific territory. It's remarkable that in the early 21st century, there's a vast field of science, both with domestic and wild animals, that's virtually unexplored. The reason it's unexplored is because it's a taboo, that people within the scientific world have not felt free to explore this area, and still don't. Yet there could be dozens of really fascinating PhD projects in this area, and we'd find out a great deal more about the way animal behavior is coordinated in the wild. Before telephones, the only way people could communicate at a distance would have been telepathy. If it exists, it would have been probably quite useful to know other people's needs, and especially their needs when they're at a distance. One of the categories of behavior I heard about from many people, from women, was about mothers who feel they could pick up telepathically when their baby needed them. Many nursing mothers have had the experience of going back to work or starting to leave the baby when it's 3 or 4 months old, and when they're away from the baby, feeling their milk let down. Now, the milk let down reflex is an oxytocin-mediated reflex that causes the breasts to start expressing milk, the nipples leak. It's normally caused by the baby crying, and mothers feel it, it gets the breast ready to feed the baby. It's a well-known physiological response. And when mothers felt their milk letting down, often through feeling their breast tingle, when they were away from the baby, most mothers just assumed their baby needed them. And until recently, they simply went home. Now they ring home on a mobile phone. And they're usually right. I did a study with 20 nursing mothers over a 2-month period in North London, where we monitored the mothers every time they were out away from the baby and monitored the baby. And we found the milk letdowns were synchronized with the baby's need in an extraordinarily significant way, odds against chance of 1 billion to 1. And it wasn't just routine times. We could control for that because we knew when all these things were happening. So here again is a huge potential area for research, completely untouched, virgin territory. No one has looked at it. It would be a great PhD project for someone working in, for a midwife, for example, or people who work with nursing mothers. And there again, you can see that if this is indeed true, as I think it is, then it would be useful. The mothers who had who could tell when their baby needed them when they were at a distance from the baby would tend to have babies that survived better than mothers that couldn't tell. There'd be selective pressures in favor of this ability. It would play a useful role. The basic experiment involves finding people who say this happens to them, and then they give me the names and phone numbers of 4 friends, people they know well, or family members. They sit at home with a landline telephone, no caller ID system, being filmed on videotape. We then pick one of the 4 callers at random by the throw of a die or with a random number table, and ring them up and ask them to ring the subject. Within 2 minutes they do so. So the subject's sitting there, the phone rings, and they have to guess who it is before they pick it up. So they say, it rings, I think it's John, they pick it up, hello John. They're right or they're wrong. a 1 in 4 chance of being right by pure guesswork, 25%. Well, in these experiments, it turns out the hit rate is considerably higher than that. These are from more than 400 filmed telephone telepathy tests. The chance level is on the left, 25%. The actual hit rate was 45%. This was a highly significant. P is 1 times 10 to the minus 12. It's a highly significant result. We then tested, did some further tests where 2 of the callers were familiar people, the other 2 were strangers who the people had never met. And what we found there was on the left with the 2 unfamiliar people, the hit rate was only just above chance. With the familiar people, it was more than twice the chance level, 52%, showing that telepathy occurs much more between people who are bonded, who have bonds, emotional or social bonds with each other, than strangers. Unfortunately, many parapsychology experiments have involved getting total strangers into the laboratory and testing them on card guessing and Ganzfeld experiments. When they have had people who know each other well, the results are much stronger, the effect is much bigger. This is a summary of some of the features of this kind of telepathy. It's been replicated at Amsterdam and Freiburg universities. It doesn't depend on distance. We've done experiments up to and including Australia and New Zealand. With young Australians and New Zealanders we recruited from the Earl's Court area of London. And 2 of their callers were new acquaintances in Britain. The other 2 were family members or girlfriends or boyfriends down under. And they actually did better with the people down under than with their new acquaintances, showing that what matters is emotional closeness, not physical proximity. Of course, with telephone telepathy, you can do experiments over any distance you like, up to the Antipodes. Now, very similar things occur with emails. Exactly the same kind of phenomenon is reported by many people with emails. They think of someone and then they get an email from them. It's one of the ways in which this ability to pick up people's intentions is evolving along with technology. Telephones came first, emails are much later. But we did very similar experiments with emails. People had 4 emailers. They had to guess who was sending them an email out of these 4 people at, say, 12 o'clock. And at 12 o'clock, the person was writing them that email, and they didn't send it till 12:01 after we'd received the guess. And the beauty of emails is the time is actually printed into the email. The technology gives you the exact time to the second, so you can be sure the guess was made before the email was received. We filmed people doing these to make sure they weren't cheating with phone calls or instant messages. And the results of the emailed tests shows, again, the 25% chance level is on the left. The actual hit rate was 47%. Again, a highly significant result. We did more than 200 of these tests. Again, we compared familiar and unfamiliar callers with very similar results to the telephone experiment. And I've developed 2 or 3 years ago an automated email telepathy test where the whole procedure was automated. People entered the names, the computer did the picking of the people at random, sending them the messages, and coordinated the whole test. We did it with 3 senders, not 4, so the hit rate by chance is 33% on the left. The actual hit rate is 42%. Again, it's a significant, quite significant result. I have to say that most skeptics, there are some very reasonable skeptics and well-informed skeptics. One of them is Chris French, who's also been supported by the Perrott Warwick Fund. But some of them are not very well-informed. During the controversy in the Times and elsewhere that occurred after the British Association meeting that Bernard Carr referred to at the beginning of this gathering, I was denounced by Professor Peter Atkins, who's a leading skeptic at Oxford, a chemist, saying that the British Association should never have allowed anyone to talk about this pseudo-scientific topic. And then I was asked to take part in an interview with him on BBC Radio 5. He said in the Times, as you see at the top, no reason to suppose that telepathy is anything other than a charlatan's fantasy. in the discussion on Radio 5, I said to him, Professor Atkins, have you actually looked at the evidence? He said, no, of course not. I said, why not? He said, well, if I did, he said, I'd be very, very suspicious of it. And I said, there's a word for that. It's called prejudice. He simply didn't know. He was prepared to stand up in public to the entire nation and announce that it was a fantasy, there was nothing in complete ignorance. Now, how is that possible? Not one of us could stand up and denounce modern research in quantum physics or radio astronomy with complete absence of any information at all. But when it comes to telepathy, a surprisingly large number of otherwise intelligent people feel that they have the right to pronounce in a state of ignorance. Professor Lewis Wolpert appeared denouncing my research on a TV show. The people asked him in advance if he'd like to see the tapes of the experiments before he commented on them, and he said no, absolutely no need, and then said what you read there. There's no evidence for any person, animal or thing being telepathic. I challenged him to a public debate at the Royal Society of Arts, which happened a few years ago with a judge in the chair. It was written up in Nature, and it was perfectly clear he knew nothing of the evidence, and he didn't want to know it either, because in the lecture, while I was showing the evidence on the screen, he sat at a table tapping a pencil, looking bored, staring into the distance, and didn't turn around to look at the evidence behind him. And Professor Richard Dawkins, who until recently was Professor of Public Understanding of Science, came to interview me for his recent TV series called Enemies of Reason, a sequel to his program on religion called The Root of All Evil. I made it a condition of seeing him for this program that it was a discussion about evidence. I said I wasn't interested in taking part in another of his low-grade debunking programs. So they said, yes, it was about evidence, it would be completely fair, he was really interested in hearing the evidence and so forth. So I agreed to it. He came to see me. And when he arrived, after a bit of preliminary banter and him saying how this was just wishful thinking, I said, well, look, we've met to discuss the evidence, why don't we do that? He said, I don't want to discuss the evidence. And I said, why not? He said, it's too hard, it's too difficult. I said, most people can understand it. He said, we haven't time. I said, it only takes a few minutes. He said, anyway, it's not what this program's about. And I said, oh, really? I said, I thought I'd made it clear I didn't want to take part in another low-grade debunking program. It's not a low-grade debunking program, it's a high-grade debunking program. The director then said, cut. And I asked him if it was true. He said, yes, it was another Dawkins polemic. He didn't tell me when they asked me to take part that I was going to be portrayed as an enemy of reason for doing research in this field. But it is extraordinary, the passions that this subject can arouse in the minds of people who claim to be on the side of science, reason, and evidence. I'm sure everybody in this room has encountered skeptics of that kind. I think one of the reasons for the fear, as I said at the beginning, is that if telepathy exists, it would lead to an overthrow of science as we know it, turn the laws of nature upside down, and so forth. I don't think it would. The development of Faraday's work on electromagnetism and Maxwell's equations didn't destroy the whole of Newtonian physics, it added to it. And I think that admitting the existence of telepathy as a natural feature of animal communication would enlarge our view of animal nature and human nature. Consciousness studies is one of the most exciting areas of science at the moment. And within consciousness studies, there's no agreed model of the nature of the mind. It's, by philosophers of mind, it's called the hard problem. No one knows how consciousness relates to the brain or the mind. It's not as if we have a certain totally correct understanding of the nature of minds with predictions to 7 places in decimals. It's not like that. We don't understand how the mind works. I think if we take on board these phenomena, then I think it would lead to an enhanced understanding of the mind, and which is exactly what Frederick Myers thought when he started his research on telepathy here in Trinity. The final point I'd like to make is this. All around the world, telepathic phenomena and other psychic phenomena like premonitions are taken for granted in traditional societies. For example, Sir Lawrence van der Post, when he was living with the Bushmen of the Kalahari, told a story of how, when they went out hunting, the bushmen he was with were convinced that the people back in the village would know when they'd shot a deer. And he says, as we were heading back in Land Rovers laden with meat, I asked one of the bushmen how the people would react when they learned of our success. He replied, they already know. They know by wire. We bushmen have a wire here, tapping his chest, that brings us news. He was comparing their means of communication with the white men's telegram or wire. Sure enough, when we approached the camp, the people were singing the eland song and preparing to give the hunters the greatest of welcomes. This kind of story from people who've lived in Africa is very common. When I lived in India, I found that most people completely take these phenomena for granted. In traditional societies, they're extremely well known and used and developed and cultivated. Unfortunately, I think that many anthropologists, who are the people who study these societies, have gone into the field with the mindset that these things are impossible and have not studied what actually would have been some of the most fascinating things to observe and look at. So I think one of the things we can do is if we admit that this is a normal, natural kind of phenomenon, is to look at its incidence in other societies, which hasn't been done. Almost all telepathic research has been done in European and countries and in America. So I think that this is a field of research that is just at the beginning. It's extraordinary. In the 21st century, as I said, we have a field of inquiry that's hardly explored. It's hardly been explored because of the power of the taboos that have restrained exploration in this area. But I think if we just forget about those taboos and treat this as a rational scientific inquiry into natural phenomena, I think science will benefit. It will become much more powerful if science investigates these phenomena than if scientists feel they have to pretend they don't exist and deny them in the face of evidence that most people know is real. And it gives scientists an image of being prejudiced and dogmatic and even fanatical. I just think it'd be better for science and better for our understanding of nature if we can approach these things in a rational spirit of inquiry. And I'd like to end by saying I feel very grateful to Trinity College and to the Perrott Warwick bequest for enabling me to do research in this area for 5 years, which I think is, as the bequest was intended, is something that can help and continue to help the legacy that Myers founded while he was here at Trinity. Thank you.